A racist man publicly humiliates a black chef, mocking him as a nobody. But when the chef's brave revelation exposes the truth, it shocks everyone and forces the man to confront his deepest prejudice. The restaurant buzzed with energy on a Friday night, filled with diners enjoying their meals and the rhythmic clinking of silverware. At the back of the kitchen, Marcus Hayes, a talented black chef in his mid-30s, moved with precision and grace. His knives sliced vegetables into perfect cubes, and his sauté pan flared with fire as he worked tirelessly to prepare dishes that earned rave reviews from customers. Marcus was not just a chef, he was an artist, pouring his heart into every plate. Outside the kitchen, in the dimly lit dining area, Gerald Thompson, a middle-aged businessman with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, sat at a table with his colleagues. Gerald had a reputation for being blunt to the point of cruelty, and tonight, his mood was sourer than the wine he swirled lazily in his glass. "This place used to be better," Gerald muttered to his companions, his voice dripping with disdain. "Ever since they changed management, the food's been average at best." One of his colleagues hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Well, I've heard the head chef is quite talented. People say he's the reason this place has been getting so much attention." Gerald scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Talented, huh? We'll see about that." As if on cue, Marcus stepped out of the kitchen to deliver a special dish to another table. He wore a clean white apron and carried himself with quiet confidence, though his tired eyes hinted at the long hours he'd endured. Gerald's eyes narrowed as he spotted Marcus. "Hey!" Gerald called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. Marcus paused, turning toward the table with a polite smile. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice calm and professional. Gerald gave a dismissive wave, gesturing toward his plate. "This steak? Overcooked. I asked for medium rare, and this is barely a step above shoe leather." Marcus stepped closer, inspecting the plate with a practiced eye. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Let me take this back to the kitchen and prepare a new one for you." Gerald sneered, shaking his head. "You know what? Never mind. It's not like you'd get it right the second time. Let me guess. This is what happens when someone with no real training tries to act like a professional." The room seemed to hush, the tension thick as other diners began to glance toward the commotion. Marcus's hands tightened around the plate, but he maintained his composure, offering a small nod. "I assure you, sir, we take pride in our food, and—" Gerald interrupted, his voice louder now. "Pride? Is that what you call this? A second-rate chef in a second-rate restaurant? You've got some nerve calling yourself an artist." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, but he refused to let it show. He met Gerald's gaze, his expression steady. "If you're dissatisfied, sir, I'll do everything I can to make it right. It's not just my job, it's my responsibility." But Gerald wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Responsibility? Don't make me laugh. I've seen people like you before, pretending to be something you're not. Stick to what you know and leave the real work to professionals." The room was now completely silent. All eyes were on Marcus, whose chest rose and fell with steady breaths as he processed the cutting words. Inside, he was grappling with memories of past struggles, moments where his abilities had been dismissed, his talent overlooked, his very identity questioned. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, I don't know what you think you see in me, but I can promise you one thing. You don't know me, and you don't know my journey." With that, Marcus turned and walked back to the kitchen, his back straight and his resolve unbroken. Behind him, Gerald chuckled, shaking his head as if he'd won some invisible battle. But the murmurs that began to ripple through the dining room hinted otherwise. Back in the kitchen, Marcus took a deep breath, leaning against the counter for a moment to steady himself. He'd faced worse, but the sting of such open disdain always lingered. One of his sous chefs, a young woman named Clara, approached him cautiously. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah. I've dealt with men like him before. This isn't about me, it's about him." Clara hesitated before replying. "Still, it's not right. You don't deserve that." Marcus turned to her, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "You're right, Clara. I don't. But sometimes, the best way to handle people like that is to let your work speak louder than their words. As Marcus turned back to his station, a plan began to form in his mind. A way to show Gerald Thompson exactly who he was and what he stood for. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about standing tall in the face of prejudice, proving that dignity and talent couldn't be diminished by hateful words. The night was far from over, and Marcus was ready for what came next. Back in the dining room, Gerald lounged in his chair, oblivious to the uncomfortable silence that lingered in the air. He smirked as if he'd made some great statement, lifting his glass of wine in a mock toast to his colleagues, who exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. In the kitchen, however, the energy was different. Marcus moved with quiet purpose, his mind racing through possibilities. He had learned long ago that confrontation wasn't always the best path forward. Instead, he believed in letting his work speak for itself, showing, not telling, the truth of who he was and what he could do. "Clara," Marcus called over his shoulder, his voice calm but resolute. "We're making something special for Table 7. Clara frowned, stepping closer. "Table 7? You mean his table?" Marcus nodded. "That's the one. Let's give him something he'll never forget." Clara hesitated. "Are you sure?" "He doesn't deserve it after the way he treated you." Marcus smiled faintly, though there was an edge of determination in his expression. "Exactly. That's why we're doing it. People like him need to see that they can't tear others down. Not with words. Not with anything. And the best way to show that is to rise above it." Clara nodded, her respect for Marcus deepening. "What are we making?" Marcus thought for a moment, then began pulling ingredients from the fridge. "We're making my signature dish. The one that earned me my first award. The one my mom taught me." As the kitchen team rallied around him, Marcus explained the steps with precision. This wasn't just about making food. It was about telling a story. He selected fresh herbs and vegetables, handpicked the finest cut of meat, and prepared a sauce that simmered to perfection. Every movement was intentional, every decision a reflection of his years of experience, and the legacy he carried. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the tension had eased somewhat. Gerald, clearly feeling victorious, leaned back in his chair, entertaining his colleagues with stories of his business acumen. "And that's how I closed the deal," he said, finishing his tale with a self-satisfied grin. "It's all about knowing when to take charge. Some people just aren't cut out for the big leagues, you know." One of his colleagues chuckled weakly, but the others seemed distracted. Several diners had started whispering, casting glances toward the kitchen. Something was happening back there, and curiosity was spreading through the room like wildfire. As Marcus worked, his thoughts drifted to his late mother, the woman who had inspired his love of cooking. She had taught him not only the techniques, but also the philosophy of food, how it could bring people together, tell a story, and heal wounds. "When someone tries to break you down," she used to say, "build something beautiful instead." The memory brought a new wave of determination. This wasn't just about proving Gerald wrong. It was about honoring everything his mother had taught him, and showing the world the value of dignity and resilience. Finally, the dish was complete. On the plate was a beautifully cooked filet mignon, its crust seared to perfection, resting on a bed of creamy mashed potatoes. Vibrant green asparagus spears framed the dish, and a rich red wine reduction was drizzled artfully around the plate. But the true centerpiece was the garnish. A delicate edible flower Marcus had chosen deliberately. It was a flower his mother used to grow in their backyard, one that symbolized courage and grace under pressure. "Clara," Marcus said softly, holding the plate out to her. "Take this to Table 7. Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "You don't want to take it yourself?" Marcus shook his head. "Let him taste it first. Let the food speak for itself." Clara nodded, carefully lifting the plate and walking it out into the dining room. As she approached Gerald's table, the chatter around them began to fade again. All eyes were on the dish, as Clara placed it gently in front of him. Gerald raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "What's this? A peace offering?" Clara straightened her back. "This is from our head chef. He wanted you to have it." Gerald snorted, picking up his fork. "Well, it better be good, or I'll have even more to say about this place." His colleagues watched intently as Gerald cut into the fillet. The knife slid through effortlessly, revealing a perfect medium-rare center. He took a bite, his expression neutral at first, but then something shifted. His eyes widened slightly, and his chewing slowed. He took another bite, then another, his smirk fading into an expression of something almost like respect. "This is—" Gerald paused, swallowing. "This is incredible." Clara said nothing, simply watching as Gerald continued to eat, his arrogance melting with every bite. Around the room, whispers grew louder. Marcus's dish had done what no words could, silence the loudest man in the room. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. In the kitchen, he wiped his hands and prepared himself for what was coming next. This wasn't just about the food. It was about the revelation that would turn the entire night upside down. Gerald leaned back in his chair, the last bite of Marcus's masterpiece resting on his fork. His expression had shifted completely. Gone was the smug superiority that had dominated his face earlier. Instead, there was a quiet, almost reluctant admiration. "This steak," Gerald said finally, setting his fork down, "is remarkable." His colleagues exchanged surprised glances. For a man who prided himself on being untouchable and unimpressed, this admission was nothing short of extraordinary. But before anyone could comment further, the kitchen doors swung open. Marcus stepped out, his white apron immaculate and his demeanor calm, though his heart raced with anticipation. The room seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward Gerald's table, his steps steady and purposeful. Clara trailed behind him, her hands clasped nervously. She had seen Marcus handle difficult customers before, but this was different. This was personal. As Marcus reached the table, Gerald looked up at him, his fork still in hand. For a moment, neither man spoke. The weight of unspoken tension hung between them, visible even to the surrounding diners, who watched the exchange like an unfolding drama. "You must be the chef," Gerald said, breaking the silence. His tone was less biting now, though traces of his earlier arrogance remained. "I have to admit, that was the best steak I've ever had." Marcus inclined his head slightly. "I'm glad you enjoyed it, sir." Gerald gestured to the empty plate. "So, why didn't you bring this out yourself? Afraid of a little feedback?" A murmur rippled through the nearby tables, but Marcus remained composed. "Not at all," he replied. "I wanted you to taste the dish before we had this conversation." Sometimes, actions speak louder than words. Gerald raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Is that so? Well, you've proven you can cook. Congratulations. But this isn't about one good meal. You're still—" Before Gerald could finish, Marcus cut him off, not with anger, but with quiet determination. "You're right. This isn't just about one meal. It's about something much bigger." The room fell silent again, every diner now fully invested in the interaction. Even Gerald's colleagues seemed to be holding their breath. Marcus took a small step closer to the table, his voice calm but firm. "When you made those comments earlier, you didn't just insult me. You insulted every person who's ever worked hard to prove themselves, only to be dismissed because of someone else's assumptions." Gerald frowned, his defenses rising. "Listen, I didn't—" Marcus held up a hand, stopping him gently but firmly. "Let me finish." He continued, his voice steady and resonant. "You see, I wasn't always a chef. I didn't grow up with fancy ingredients or a professional kitchen. My mother raised me on her own, working 2 jobs to keep us fed. But she taught me that no matter what people think of you, your work can speak for itself. She believed that dignity and perseverance were stronger than any insult." Gerald shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable now. Marcus's words weren't just cutting, they were resonating. "This dish," Marcus said, gesturing toward the empty plate, "isn't just food. It's a part of my journey, the same journey that brought me to culinary school, where I graduated at the top of my class, the same journey that led me to win awards for my cooking and eventually become the head chef of this restaurant." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some diners exchanged surprised glances, clearly impressed by Marcus's achievements. But Marcus wasn't finished. He took another step closer, his gaze fixed on Gerald. "And you know what else? That flower on your plate? It's called an echinacea. My mother used to grow them in our backyard because they symbolize resilience. So when you mocked me tonight, I didn't see it as a personal attack. I saw it as an opportunity to show you who I really am and remind you that everyone you meet is carrying more than you could ever imagine." The room erupted into soft applause, diners nodding in agreement and admiration. Gerald, however, looked stunned. For once, the man who always had a clever retort was speechless. Finally, Gerald cleared his throat, struggling to find the words. I didn't realize. I didn't know. Marcus gave him a small, understanding smile. No, you didn't, but now you do. Gerald looked down at his empty plate, his earlier smugness completely replaced by a mix of shame and something else, respect. Marcus straightened, his voice gentle but unwavering. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we realize them. The choice is yours, sir. With that, Marcus turned and walked back toward the kitchen, the applause growing louder as he disappeared through the doors. As Marcus disappeared into the kitchen, Gerald sat frozen at his table. The noise in the dining room returned, but it wasn't the same. Hushed whispers and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people reflected on what they'd just witnessed. Gerald's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a younger man named Eric, leaned forward, breaking the awkward silence. Gerald, I think you owe that man an apology. Gerald stiffened, his jaw tightening. An apology? For what? Eric interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. For everything you said. You humiliated him in front of the entire room, and he still treated you with respect. He didn't just prove you wrong. He showed you a level of grace most people wouldn't. The words hung in the air, and Gerald felt a flicker of anger rising in his chest. He hated being called out, especially in public, but as he opened his mouth to defend himself, a nagging thought stopped him. Eric wasn't wrong. He looked down at the empty plate in front of him, the lingering taste of Marcus's masterpiece still fresh on his palate. It wasn't just food. It was a message, a challenge, a mirror reflecting his own flaws. For the first time in a long while, Gerald felt something unfamiliar. Shame. He glanced around the room, noticing the way other diners avoided his gaze. It was clear they weren't just judging him. They were disappointed. That realization stung more than any insult ever could. Gerald, one of the women at the table said softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. You've always been direct, but tonight, maybe you crossed a line. Gerald exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He was a man who prided himself on control, on always having the upper hand. But now, sitting there under the weight of his own actions, he realized he had none. Behind the swinging doors, Marcus leaned against the counter, letting out a long breath. The adrenaline from the encounter was wearing off, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. Clara approached him cautiously, a small smile tugging at her lips. You handled that better than I would have. Marcus chuckled softly. You mean you would have thrown the steak at him? She grinned. Something like that. The kitchen staff, who had been quietly observing from the corners, began to chime in. Chef, that was incredible, one of them said. Yeah, added another. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us. Marcus looked around at his team, his chest swelling with pride. I didn't do it just for me, he said. People like Gerald, they exist everywhere, and the only way to change their minds is to show them that the world is bigger than their narrow perspective. The team nodded in agreement, their respect for Marcus growing even deeper. Gerald finally stood, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape. His colleagues watched him nervously, unsure of what he would do next. Where are you going? Eric asked. Gerald hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. To the kitchen, he said simply. Eric raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that? Gerald nodded, though his expression was hard to read. I just need to say something. Without waiting for a response, he crossed the room, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached the kitchen doors, his palms were damp, and his throat felt dry. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong, but something about Marcus's words, and the grace with which he had delivered them, left Gerald with no other choice. The kitchen went silent as Gerald stepped through the doors. The staff turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. Marcus was at the far end of the counter, chopping herbs with practiced precision. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, his eyes met Gerald's with the same calm intensity as before. Sir, Marcus said simply, setting down his knife. Gerald cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very small. I came to talk to you. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. I'm listening. For a moment, Gerald faltered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. But then he remembered the chef's words. The choice was his. I owe you an apology, Gerald said finally. his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I was out of line. The things I said, they weren't just wrong. They were cruel. And you didn't deserve that. The room was so quiet that even the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed loud. Marcus didn't respond right away, letting the weight of Gerald's words settle. Finally he spoke, his tone measured. I appreciate your apology, but words are just the start. If you really want to make a difference, it's about more than saying sorry. It's about understanding why you said those things in the first place, and doing the work to change. Gerald swallowed hard, nodding slowly. You're right, he said. I've spent too much time thinking I'm better than other people. Maybe it's time I started listening instead of judging. Marcus studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. We all have room to grow. What matters is what you do next. Gerald hesitated, then shook Marcus's hand firmly. In that moment, something shifted, not just in Gerald, but in the atmosphere of the entire kitchen. As Gerald left the kitchen, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, their admiration for Marcus evident. Clara leaned closer to him, her voice low. Do you think he meant it? Marcus wiped his hands on a towel, his face thoughtful. I think he's starting to. But real change takes time. Meanwhile, Gerald returned to his table, his demeanor completely transformed. Gone was the smug, self-assured man who had mocked Marcus earlier in the evening. Now, he looked reflective, even humble. His colleagues watched him with cautious curiosity as he sat down and folded his hands on the table. Well? Eric asked, breaking the silence. Gerald let out a slow breath. I apologized, and? Gerald stared at the tablecloth for a moment before answering. And he's a better man than I'll ever be. I walked in here tonight thinking I had all the answers, thinking I knew exactly who he was just by looking at him. He shook his head, his voice tinged with regret. I was wrong. That man has more talent, more grace, and more strength than I could ever hope to have. His colleagues exchanged glances, surprised by his candor. One of the women at the table spoke softly. It's never too late to change, Gerald. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but sincere. I hope you're right. Life in the restaurant returned to normal, though the night of Gerald's visit had become something of a legend among the staff. Marcus continued his work with the same dedication and passion, but something about him seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. One evening, Clara rushed into the kitchen holding a thick envelope. Chef, this came for you. Marcus wiped his hands and took the envelope, his name scrawled neatly on the front. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small card. As he read, his brow furrowed, and then his lips curved into a faint smile. What is it? Clara asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Marcus handed her the card. It was a certificate of donation to a local culinary school's scholarship fund, enough to cover the tuition for one student. Attached was a note. Marcus, thank you for teaching me a lesson I desperately needed. I hope this small gesture can help someone else follow in your footsteps. Harold Thompson. Clara's eyes widened. He donated to a scholarship fund? Marcus nodded. Looks like he's trying to make good on his promise to change. Do you believe he's really changed? She asked. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. I think he's starting to. Change doesn't happen overnight, but this is a step in the right direction. Gerald sat in his office, the same thick envelope sitting on his desk. He stared at a stack of books he had ordered on bias and privilege, their spines unbroken. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his flaws. He was confronting them head-on. He picked up a picture frame from his desk, a photo of his late father, a man who had always taught him to stand his ground and never back down. For years, Gerald had mistaken those lessons for excuses to act superior. Now he saw them for what they really were, a fear of vulnerability. He set the picture down and opened his laptop, typing a long overdue email. A week later, Gerald returned to the restaurant, but this time, he wasn't there to dine. He carried a simple bouquet of flowers and waited patiently at the hostess stand. When Marcus finally emerged from the kitchen, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Gerald, Marcus said, stepping forward. Back so soon? I wanted to thank you, Gerald said, holding out the bouquet. Not just for the meal, but for the lesson. You didn't have to treat me with the grace you did, but you did anyway. And it changed me. Marcus accepted the flowers with a small smile. It's never too late to do the right thing, Gerald. Gerald nodded. I've started making changes in my life. I even set up a program at my company to sponsor local culinary students. It's not enough, but it's a start. Marcus extended his hand. It's more than a start. It's growth. Keep going. As Gerald left the restaurant that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his old habits and prejudices was starting to lift, replaced by a newfound understanding of what it meant to be human. In the kitchen, Marcus placed the flowers in a glass jar and smiled as he returned to work. He wasn't just a chef. He was a teacher, a leader, and a reminder that kindness and resilience could transform even the most stubborn hearts. The restaurant buzzed around him, but for Marcus, the night felt calm and fulfilled. He had shown the world, and himself, that grace and dignity were stronger than any insult, and that even the hardest of hearts could learn to change. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with words or anger, but with kindness, perseverance, and the courage to stand tall in the face of prejudice. Marcus's story is a reminder that we all have the power to inspire change, one small act of grace at a time.